Professor Richard Harmon closed the worn volume of The World as Will and Representation and gazed out the window of his office. Outside, autumn leaves swirled in patterns that seemed to mirror the chaos of his thoughts. At 46, Richard was considered one of the leading scholars on pessimist philosophy in the Western world. His books on metaphysics were translated into 17 languages. His lectures filled auditoriums across 3 continents, and his latest work on the illusion of happiness had earned him the prestigious Hegel Award. Yet, in the quietude of his office, surrounded by accolades and leather-bound first editions, Richard felt a profound emptiness that no intellectual achievement could fill. The finalization papers for his 3rd divorce had arrived that morning, unceremoniously delivered by a courier who seemed in a hurry to be elsewhere. "The life of the mind demands solitude," he whispered to himself, a mantra he had repeated through each failed relationship. 3 marriages, 3 divorces. The pattern was undeniable, and increasingly, it haunted him. He picked up the small photograph on his desk, Elizabeth, his first wife, smiling on their honeymoon in Vienna. She had been a brilliant art historian, but after 5 years, she left with the devastating accusation, "You love dead philosophers more than living people, Richard." Then came Sophia, a concert pianist whose emotional depth had initially captivated him. Their relationship lasted 7 years before dissolving into mutual resentment. "You listen to me play for hours," she had said during their last argument, "but you never hear me when I speak." Most recently, there was Claire, a fellow philosophy professor whose intellectual compatibility with Richard had seemed promising. 3 years later, she departed with a philosophical precision that cut deeper than any emotional outburst. "You understand the human condition in theory, Richard, but you've never truly participated in it." The telephone interrupted his ruminations. It was his department chair, reminding him of the interview scheduled for that afternoon. Some journalist was writing a profile on contemporary philosophical voices. Richard had agreed weeks ago, before his personal life had once again collapsed around him. "Send her up at 3, he said tiredly. Perhaps talking about ideas would provide a temporary escape from the wreckage of his emotional life. Katherine Wells was not what Richard had expected. Most journalists who interviewed him were either intimidated by his reputation or aggressively intent on challenging him. Katherine was neither. She entered his office with quiet confidence, declined his offer of tea with a smile, and sat across from him with a well-worn copy of his latest book open to a heavily annotated page. "Professor Harmon," she began, "your work on Schopenhauer's concept of will as the driving force behind human suffering has resonated with readers far beyond academic circles. Why do you think that is?" Richard gave his standard response, one he had refined over countless interviews. But Katherine's follow-up questions were anything but standard. She pressed him on inconsistencies, highlighted connections between disparate passages, and demonstrated a grasp of Schopenhauer that rivaled many of his colleagues. "You've actually read my work," he remarked, unable to hide his surprise. "All of it," she confirmed, "including your early papers on aesthetic contemplation as temporary release from the will. I'm particularly interested in how your thinking has evolved on that subject." For the next hour, their conversation flowed with an intellectual intensity Richard hadn't experienced in years. Katherine challenged him without antagonism and disagreed with respect. When she finally closed her notebook, Richard realized he had forgotten about his divorce papers, forgotten about his loneliness, forgotten even the passage of time. "One last question, if you don't mind," Katherine said, her tone shifting slightly. "Your work frequently returns to Schopenhauer's views on relationships, particularly his controversial opinions about women. In your most recent book, you quote his assertion that women are directly fitted for acting as the nurses and teachers of our early childhood by the fact that they are themselves childish, frivolous, and short-sighted. Do you personally subscribe to this view?" The question caught Richard off guard. He had included the quote as historical context, one of many examples of Schopenhauer's misogyny that modern scholarship acknowledged but did not endorse. At least, that's what he told himself. Schopenhauer was a product of his time, he began, carefully. And his views on women reflect the limitations of... I'm not asking for historical contextualization, Katherine interrupted gently. I'm asking whether you, Richard Harmon, in the 21st century, believe there's any truth to Schopenhauer's claim that, as he put it elsewhere, most women don't want great men because they prefer mediocrity they can control. Richard fell silent, suddenly aware that his answer mattered more than academic precision would dictate. I think, he said slowly, that there may be a kernel of truth obscured by Schopenhauer's obvious prejudice. Not about women's intellectual capacity, which history has thoroughly disproven, but about the difficulty of living with greatness, or what society labels as such. Katherine's expression remained neutral, encouraging him to continue. Great achievements often demand great sacrifices, not just from the achiever, but from those connected to them. Perhaps what Schopenhauer misinterpreted as women rejecting greatness was actually a rejection of the collateral damage that often accompanies it. As the words left his mouth, Richard felt the uncomfortable sensation of a truth long avoided finally taking shape. Over the next several weeks, Katherine continued her research for the profile, meeting Richard regularly. Their conversations ranged far beyond the parameters of the interview, exploring everything from Eastern mysticism to quantum physics to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Richard found himself looking forward to their meetings with an enthusiasm that surprised him. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, they sat in a small cafe near campus, sheltered from the downpour by steamed windows and the comforting aroma of coffee. Katherine had just shared her critique of his chapter on Schopenhauer's concept of the veil of Maya, the illusion that keeps humans trapped in a cycle of desire and suffering. You write brilliantly about how the veil clouds our perception, she noted, but you stop short of exploring how we might see through it. Schopenhauer offered limited pathways, Richard replied. Aesthetic contemplation provides temporary relief, and compassion offers glimpses beyond individual will. But ultimately, his philosophy leads to resignation. Katherine leaned forward. What if that's where he went wrong? What if the veil isn't just lifted through art or abstract compassion, but through genuine connection with other conscious beings? Connection is temporary, Richard countered. Ultimately, we're alone in our consciousness. Are we? Katherine challenged. Or is that just what we tell ourselves when connection becomes too difficult, too demanding? Richard was about to launch into his well-rehearsed lecture on the fundamentally isolated nature of consciousness when Katherine's phone rang. Her expression changed immediately as she answered it, tension evident in her posture. I have to go, she said after a brief conversation. My daughter's school called. She's running a fever. You have a daughter? Richard asked, realizing how little he knew about Katherine's personal life despite weeks of intellectual intimacy. Yes, Sophia. She's 8. Katherine gathered her belongings quickly. I'm sorry to cut this short. Of course, Richard said, watching as she rushed out into the rain without an umbrella, her interview notes clutched protectively inside her jacket. Left alone at the table, Richard felt a strange emptiness descend. For weeks he had been sharing his most profound thoughts with this woman, yet he hadn't once inquired about her life beyond their philosophical discussions. The realization was uncomfortable and somehow familiar. The following day, Richard canceled his office hours and found himself driving to the address listed on Katherine's business card. He told himself he was merely being considerate, checking on her daughter's condition and rescheduling their interview. But a more honest part of him recognized a deeper motivation. The modest house in a tree-lined suburban neighborhood was nothing like he had imagined. A swing set stood in the small front yard, and colorful chalk drawings decorated the driveway. Richard hesitated before ringing the doorbell, suddenly aware of the presumption in his unannounced visit. Katherine opened the door in sweatpants and an oversized university sweatshirt, her professional demeanor replaced by obvious surprise. Professor Harmon? Richard, he corrected automatically. I wanted to see if your daughter was feeling better. Katherine's expression softened. That's unexpectedly thoughtful. She's resting now, the fever's down. She hesitated, then stepped aside. Would you like to come in? I just made tea." The interior of the house revealed a life Richard had never considered. Bookshelves lined the walls, but they contained an eclectic mix of philosophy texts, children's literature, and mystery novels. Family photographs showed Katherine with a young girl who had her eyes and smile, at beaches, museums, and what appeared to be a science fair. "You're a single mother," Richard observed as Katherine handed him a cup of tea. "For 6 years now," she confirmed. Sophia's father decided academic philosophy and family life were incompatible. He chose the former. The irony wasn't lost on Richard. "Yet you've managed both." "Not always gracefully," Katherine admitted. "But necessarily. The abstract doesn't have to exclude the concrete. In fact, I think one enriches the other." As they talked, Richard began to see Katherine in a different light. She wasn't just a formidable intellect who challenged his ideas. She was a woman navigating multiple worlds with a grace he had never mastered. Her understanding of Schopenhauer wasn't despite her responsibilities as a mother, but somehow enhanced by them. "May I ask you something personally?" Katherine said after a comfortable silence. Richard nodded, anticipating a question about his divorces, which had become public knowledge since the latest one. "Why philosophy?" "Not academically, but personally." "What drew you to these questions about existence?" No one had asked him that question in decades. Richard looked into his tea, searching for an answer that wasn't rehearsed. "When I was 12, he began slowly. My father died suddenly, heart attack while driving. The philosophical explanations offered by religion, by well-meaning adults, they all rang hollow. I wanted truth, even if it was difficult. Schopenhauer was the first philosopher I read who didn't try to sugarcoat existence." "And he became your guide," Katherine said softly. "Yes." His pessimism felt honest. His recognition that life is inherently filled with suffering, that happiness is merely the temporary absence of pain. It matched my experience. "But did it expand your experience?" Katherine asked. "Or did it merely confirm what you already believed?" Before Richard could answer, a small voice called from upstairs. "Mom?" "Excuse me," Katherine said, rising. "Duty calls." Left alone in the living room, Richard's eyes fell on a framed quotation on the wall, not from Schopenhauer or any philosopher he recognized. "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love." Rainer Maria Rilke, he realized. A poet who had found beauty in the same world Schopenhauer had deemed irredeemably tragic. The profile, Katherine, was writing never materialized, at least not in its original form. Instead, over the following months, they began collaborating on a book that examined Schopenhauer's philosophy through a contemporary lens, challenging its foundations while honoring its insights. Their working relationship evolved gradually, punctuated by dinners at Richard's apartment and weekend afternoons at Katherine's house, where Sophia would sometimes join their discussions with the unfiltered curiosity only children possess. "If everything is will and representation," the 8-year-old asked one Sunday, looking up from her coloring book, "then what am I drawing? Is it just will?" Richard and Katherine exchanged glances, equally amused and challenged by the question. "What, do you think you're drawing?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "A dinosaur wearing a tutu," Sophia answered matter-of-factly, "but also happiness. Can you draw happiness?" The question lingered with Richard long after the evening ended. Schopenhauer would have dismissed it as childish naivety, but increasingly, Richard found himself questioning the limitations of his philosophical hero. On a crisp winter evening, as they walked through the snowy campus after a lecture they had co-presented, Katherine broached the subject they had been circling for weeks. "You've been revising your views on Schopenhauer's conception of relationships," she observed. "I have," Richard admitted. "I'm beginning to think his views on women, on love, on connection, they weren't peripheral to his philosophy, but a fundamental flaw within it." "How so?" Katherine prompted, her breath visible in the cold air. "Schopenhauer saw relationships primarily through the lens of will. biological imperatives disguised as emotion. But what if connection between conscious beings is actually the one thing that can help us transcend the will? What if compassion isn't just a temporary ethical principle, but the foundation for something more profound? They had reached Katherine's car, snow collecting on their coats as they stood facing each other. "Are you suggesting that Schopenhauer's great revelation, that most women don't want great men, might be completely backward?" Katherine asked. "That perhaps greatness itself needs redefinition?" Richard nodded slowly. Maybe true greatness isn't intellectual isolation or freedom from attachment. Maybe it's the courage to remain engaged with life despite knowing its fundamental challenges. Not resignation, but participation. Katherine's eyes held his, snow gathering on her eyelashes. "That sounds dangerously like optimism, Professor Harmon." "Perhaps," Richard smiled. "Or just a different kind of pessimism. One that acknowledges suffering, but doesn't use it as an excuse for disconnection." As they stood there in the gentle snowfall, Richard realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding, not just of philosophy, but of himself. The shocking truth wasn't that women rejected greatness, but that greatness itself had been misconceived. True greatness wasn't solitary achievement or intellectual superiority. It was the capacity to remain open, vulnerable, and connected, despite the inevitable suffering that entailed. "Would you and Sophia like to come to the symphony on Friday?" he asked suddenly. "They're performing Beethoven's Ninth, a rather un-Schopenhauerian celebration of human connection." Katherine smiled, a warmth that defied the winter chill. "I think we would like that very much." 1 year later, Richard stood in the garden of Katherine's house, now their house, watching as Sophia explained the rules of an elaborate game she had invented to the guests at their small gathering. The occasion was the publication of their book, Beyond the Veil, Reimagining Schopenhauer for the Modern Age, which had received unexpected attention both within and beyond academic circles. "She has your preciseness with language," observed Elizabeth, Richard's first wife, who had surprisingly become a friend over the past months. But Katherine's imagination, "She's entirely her own person," Richard replied, watching as the child orchestrated adults 3 times her age with confident authority. "You seem happy," Elizabeth noted, with genuine warmth rather than accusation. "It suits you," Richard considered. This. Happy wasn't quite the right word. Schopenhauer would argue it never could be, given the nature of existence. But there was something else, something the pessimist philosopher had perhaps never fully grasped. "I'm engaged," he said finally. "With life, with its contradictions, with other people. Not just ideas about them." He paused, watching as Katherine laughed at something one of their colleagues said. "Schopenhauer believed suffering was intrinsic to existence, and I still think he was right about that. But he was wrong to conclude that detachment was the answer." Elizabeth smiled. "So what is the answer according to the revised philosophy of Richard Harmon?" Richard thought about the journey of the past year, the arguments with Katherine that had pushed his thinking in new directions, the unexpected joy of helping Sophia with homework, the ordinary challenges of merging lives that had once seemed impossible to navigate. "Not an answer," he said finally. "A practice. Nietzsche called it amor fati, the love of fate including its suffering. Not resignation to it, but active embrace." As Katherine approached them, her hand finding his with casual intimacy, Richard realized that the veil of Maya, the illusion Schopenhauer had warned against, wasn't just individual desire or attachment. Perhaps the greater illusion was the belief that we could think our way out of the human condition rather than through it, with all its messy connections and contradictions. "Ready to sign some books?" Katherine asked, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of work well done. Richard nodded, but lingered a moment longer, absorbing the scene around him, the mixture of academic colleagues and neighborhood friends. Elizabeth, engaged in animated conversation with Katherine's sister, Sophia organizing adults into some new game of her invention. This wasn't the life he had envisioned when he first encountered Schopenhauer's works as a grieving 12-year-old, nor was it the solitary scholarly existence he had pursued for decades. It was something more complicated, more challenging, and infinitely richer. The shocking truth wasn't that women didn't want great men. It was that greatness itself had been misunderstood all along, not as intellectual isolation or freedom from attachment, but as the courage to remain fully engaged with life despite knowing its fundamental challenges. As he followed Katherine into the house, Richard thought of the Nietzsche quote that now hung alongside Rilke's in their living room. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Perhaps that was the final lesson Schopenhauer had, missed in his brilliance. That wisdom wasn't about transcending the chaos of existence, but learning to dance with it.